All right. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you for spending a little bit of your evening with us on this Monday evening. We'll do some quick introductions for our facilitators in a couple minutes. But you're here tonight for our fifth TAAS session hosted by HRUSA. This is really focused on human rights education as a response to polarization happening both on a national level and on a global level. And again, we're really appreciative for you spending some time with us this evening. So our quick agenda for this evening, as we are kind of welcoming everyone and checking in, again, please feel free to continue introducing yourself in the chat. We'll go over some group expectations and norms in a minute or so. And then we're going to really kind of lay the groundwork for polarization, both in the higher education level and at the K to 12 education level. So we're going to really kind of go in two different directions this evening and really speak about the stakes of polarization in these respective spaces. We'll also have some time for kind of two respective breakout sessions. The first one focused on kind of analyzing these problems and really generating some possibilities in kind of small breakout rooms. We're going to bring it back together for a full group debrief. And then we'll go back out into another set of breakout rooms where we'll dive a little bit deeper into some strategy building and some methods on how to confront polarization head on in our respective spaces of work. We'll bring it back for a full group debrief. And then we will do a final evaluation and some parting words for this evening. So we have a full agenda for this evening, and we're excited to have you on board this evening. And I'll turn over to Glenn for his introduction.
All right. So I just my introducing myself, right? This is what we're
Yeah.
doing. Jake. Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm Glenn Matoma. I am a lecturer in the discipline of human rights and political science with the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. I've been a longtime member of HRE USA, served in a bunch of different capacities, and a longtime collaborator with Jake and Christy and several of you on the call. So it's great to be back in the mix. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So Jake, you want to do your own intro?
Thank you, Glenn. So yeah, I'm Jake Skripik. I'm a social studies teacher in Manchester, Connecticut, where I teach a variety of different courses: U.S. history, human rights, conflict and peace studies. I'm also steering committee member on HRUSA, and like Glenn, I've collaborated with Christy and Glenn and a number of other folks on here. And I also serve as the co-chair for the National Council for the Social Studies, Human Rights Ed Community at National Council for Social Studies. So. Thanks all, and really appreciate again your time this evening. So, as we start most of our sessions, we just really want to ground ourselves in some group norms and expectations. Some of y'all might have seen a very similar type of acronym before. Again, as we come into these spaces, and particularly as we talk about polarization and controversial issues, we just want to make sure that when we come here, we're speaking our truths, but we're also reminded of our responsibilities as adult stakeholders. So, just as quick reminders, the RESPECT acronym, taking responsibility for our own words and fulfilling our own obligations as we come into this space, listening intently and with empathy, making sure that in our conversations this evening, we're sharing the airtime and not really dominating over others. Actively participating in a harmonious and kind of dignified way, bringing our energy, our enthusiasm, our ideas to the table, making sure that our communication is clear and effective in our dialogue with one another, and really aiming for a mutual sense of trust when we are sharing and when we are dialoguing. So, some of y'all, again, have probably seen some of these expectations before, and we know all of us will adhere to these, but we just wanted to lay those out at the beginning.
All right, great. Thank you, Jake. I thought you were gonna bust into an Aretha Franklin routine there, Respect. Yeah, no, this is great. Obviously, I think one of the challenges that today's session is designed to address is some of the barriers to respectful conversation and our ability to talk across difference in productive ways. So. I think the next section is we're going to do some introduction or framing or grounding to what we're talking about here. And I'm going to start off with a little bit about polarization itself and then give you a little perspective of how it looks from the world of higher education. And then I'll throw back to Jake. He'll talk a little bit about what he's seeing in K through 12, and then we'll come to you and we'll want to see how you're seeing this show up. What are its impacts and what are maybe even some opportunities that it's presenting. Okay, when we're talking about polarization, what are we talking about? Yeah, well, at a basic level, political polarization is defined by political scientists as the increasing sorting and homogenization around two different political poles. So this graph here, based on Pew data from several years ago, shows a shift essentially from a period in early 1994 when Republican and Democrats, as self-identified party members, really share a broad range of ideological policy positions. And so that there's a difference you can see there, but there's actually more similarity. Over the course of the subsequent 30 years, what we've seen is an increasing shift of two kinds. And this defines political polarization. One is an increasing push toward the margins of the political ideologies at hand. So the Democrats are moving further left, the Republicans are moving further right, and they're organizing around those poles. The second dimension is an increasing homogenization within each of those parties. So there's less also internal difference between the views of people who self identify as Democrats and less diversity within the views of people who self identify as Republicans. And these are a set of changes that have been happening again for the past 30 years. They're not unique to the United States. Most of the data I'm going to show you today is based in the United States. It's been happening in many democracies all over the world. And there's a lot of, theorizing among political scientists about the various causes and consequences. We don't necessarily need to get into that at this point. I think we'll come around to some of those, particularly as they're related to education, but I just wanted to point this out. But I also want to note that, this kind of polarization is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, many political scientists in the 1960s and 70s were actually calling for more polarization because they provided the two parties being closely aligned to make it difficult for voters to choose and make it difficult for change to happen through a kind of competitive electoral system. So political polarization, while it can be problematic, is not necessarily so. The other form or a particular dimension of political polarization that is widely recognized to be problematic is the other form that I want to talk about today. And that is what is referred to as affective polarization, meaning affect, the way we feel about one another. That is a change that we've seen again over the past 40, 50 years that has really had some troubling effects. So not only is there kind of this political polarization where the groups are sorting and moving, ideologically further apart, but the feeling that you have about a person in the other political party is getting worse and worse. And so you can see these trend line here in the second graph. Essentially, we all feel largely the same about our political party, which is moderately good, right, about them over this. But what went down, down, down over the past 50 years has been we really don't like people in the other party. We increasingly think that they're, bad people, stupid people, wrong people. There's just this feeling about the opposite party that is increasingly and intensely negative. And so that form of polarization is, I think, recognized as potentially quite toxic. And so I want to talk about some of those concerns that are highlighted in the literature. One is the most obvious, right, which is to say the division, right? We, are mad at each other all the time. We're divided about these political ideas, and that leads to divisions in a bunch of other aspects of our lives, right? Where we work, where we live, where we worship, right? The books we read, the TV shows we like, all of these things become increasingly divided along ideological lines. So that division, in and of itself, can be a problem, as we'll see. Another consequence is dysfunction. Right? That the ability of and we're living through the longest government shutdown in U.S. history. Part of the reason for this, of course, is this polarization, both at the political level, the kind of sorting, but also because everyone, or increasingly, we look at each other as hostile camps, and that compromising with the other side is an act of treason. And so that makes us draw increasingly hard lines, that makes us propose increasingly radical solutions, and that leads to a breakdown in a structure of government that's really premised on our ability to deliberate and compromise. So dysfunction is the second potential concern. A third is democratic erosion. And these last two are, a little more, less substantiated in the political science literature, but I think you can see how these are quite possible. So democratic erosion, what do we mean by that? We mean an increasing willingness on people within the United States in this case, but again, in countries where there is increasing affective and political polarization, to support non-democratic processes or developments. And I've got a picture here of how gerrymandering works, right? We've just kind of gone through a whole election cycle of, a kind of escalating war of gerrymandering between red states and blue states. And really, what that means is that there's increasing support for people to go beyond democratic means in order to implement policies that help their side win. If you think the other side is evil, then gerrymandering an electorate to ensure they always lose elections seems like a reasonable thing to do. And so that's one example, but there are many of people moving away from democratic norms because of this polarization. And then the last thing, of course, is the most concerning, and that is the escalating willingness to support violence as a means of advancing your political agenda. And I don't need to dwell on this too much. I think we're all too aware of the rising both incidents of violence as well as the rhetoric of violence that is permeating both our leadership and then at the kind of level of everyday citizens, that has created a context of extreme danger. Frankly, for our current political order. And so I wouldn't say all of these things are solely due to polarization, but polarization exacerbates many of them and is a kind of key focal point around which a lot of this is organized. All right. Okay. And if you have questions, like pop up a hand if you want to intervene. If I've got something totally wrong, and you're like, what the hell is he talking about? Please just intervene, put it in the chat. Happy to do that. But I just wanted to kind of set some kind of common terms for us. So the next thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about, how it shows up in higher education. And I was trying to think about different ways of doing this, and then it occurred to me, right? This is the HRE group. So what do we do? Human right education about, for, and through human rights, right? We all have this heuristic. We know it. It's kind of ingrained, maybe. Yes. I'm going to assume everybody out there with their camera off is just nodding really vigorously at that. So, instead of polarization and human rights, I'm going to rattle through polarization about human rights. Sorry, polarization about higher education, polarization through higher education, and it didn't quite fit here. It's not polarization for. So I decided to go with polarization in higher education as three ways of understanding how it's showing up in this sector. Um, so, starting with polarization in higher education. I think the interesting thing, well, one of the interesting things in here is I'm going to claim there's actually not much polarization in higher education. In higher education, it is relatively ideologically homogeneous, right? And this is a kind of recent poll from the Harvard Crimson, their student newspaper of their faculty in the arts and sciences. Again, if you broadened it out to include the med school and the business school, it would be a little less. I get it, right? So that, we can overstate this ideological homogeneity. But anybody who's worked in and around universities, I think gets a sense that it is not a place that is representative politically of the broader constituency. And so here you can see, right, 30% is very liberal, another 48% is liberal, 20% is moderate, with just, 3% on the conservative and very conservative end. So within higher education, I don't see a lot of polarization in the classic sense of a division. But that's going to have impacts on the other two in some ways. And, we can come back to this and we can unpack this. There are reasons why. And, is this really a problem, or what's the solution to this problem? I understand that. But I think it's important to note that there is relative homogeneity within higher education political views. Uh, on the other hand, polarization about higher education is quite stark and dramatically increasing, right? So here's some more data from Pew about the perspective or the views of self-identified Republican and lean Republican and Democrat and lean Democrat voters, their attitudes about higher education. And, the Democratic perspectives are largely consistent from 2012 to 2019. It's actually probably gone up in these recent years, but, again, pretty solid positive. What you see on the Republican side, though, is a dramatic switch that around between 2015 and 2017, those numbers invert from being 54% positive and 37% negative to 58% negative and 36% positive. So this shows again this skewing of views of higher education to being polarized within these communities. And that's obviously had these effects of a broader campaign against higher education in its current form by leaders on the right. So, and then the last one, what about polarization through education? So, this is similar to what you just saw, perspectives on higher education, but it's a little different because what it's suggesting here, this is data, this is voting data about college degrees. So, this is the so-called diploma divide that pollsters have been registering since 2016. Prior to 2016, college-educated voters tended to skew Republican, and particularly white college-educated voters. That all changed in 2016 and now has become the single largest determining demographic factor in voting behavior, right? Or in changing voting behavior, right? There's still ones that are predictive, but this is the one that has switched the most and has had the largest amplification, right? So you can see here, right, in these different bar charts of who's voting where, never attended college versus higher degrees. a kind of massive shift. And this is particularly true, again, among white voters, but actually shows up across the board for all voters as well. And so, what this suggests is that going to college, going through higher education, and the longer you're exposed to higher education, the more your views are going to diverge from those who don't. And again, we can talk about what we think is going on here, why this is the case. But from a higher education perspective on polarization, these are the key things that show up as kind of critical facts to be dealt with in our work. So, okay, so let me stop and pause before, since I just yammered at you for I don't know, 10 minutes. Are there questions, concerns, comments?
If I could just comment quickly just to your last point about the more education that a person has, it seems like the more their views diverge from those who don't.
Hmm.
Um, in teaching misinformation and bias to our students in our ECE class,
Hmm.
one of the things that we look closely at is just trust in literature, trust in science, trust in experts. That's my first reaction to hearing that is that the higher you go in education, the more access you have to information and facts, and the more you develop trust in research. And whereas when you try to have discourse or dialogue with someone who hasn't had that experience, um, and they're relying on a meme or something along those lines, it's very hard to have that dialogue. So I just wanted to comment, and just that's my first reaction to that.
No, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think we see that it shows up in, people's willingness to get vaccines, right, or abide by other health regulations. And I think it's an interesting question of what's upstream from that, right? Is the kind of, doubt about the expertise of the highly educated lead to, a dimmer view of higher education, or does a dim view of higher education lead to that, diminishing faith and expertise? I mean, I think these things are all wrapped up in one another in lots of interesting ways. Um, okay, is there anything else, or I'll send it to Jake to give a much happier picture about polarization in K through 12, right? No? Okay, sorry. We got more dark news for y'all. Okay, so let me reshare. Okay, and I'll send it over to Jake.
All right, thanks, Glenn. Really appreciate that. Yeah, so I think about when we are talking about polarization in K to 12, I think I'm going to speak more from an affective level and from a practice level. And I put this image up here of kind of the layers of the onion. If you've heard the metaphor before, right? You peel the one layer off, and we kind of get deeper and deeper, and the problem that we're looking at, the issue we're looking at, gets more complicated, and also we get more teary-eyed. But I think that the metaphor of the peel back the onion, I think, is appropriate when we start to dive into how polarization is not necessarily just affecting the K to 12 system, but how it's affecting the people, the people who are there in the classrooms every single day doing good work, or trying to do good work with young people. So if we can click, Len, that'd be great. So, I think I just start here. And a lot of the things I think I'll speak about, I don't think I'm going to shock anyone on this call with, but we are living in an era where um, the curriculum, the topics, the content that you teach in your classroom might be not only seen as polarized, but it might be drummed up as controversial or too hot to take on. We've seen over the last couple of years these really, I'll just say interesting fights around what is taught in our classrooms. What does it mean to actually build an inclusive, diverse classroom with inclusive, diverse curriculums? We've had, the idea of CRT being thrown around in Board of Ed meetings and in our K to 12 system in general. And I think there's this kind of back and forth of what do we want our kids to actually know and learn and be equipped with, and what are folks willing to kind of strip away and really kind of take away from the public good, let's just say, of education. So I put up here, right, you have on one side folks who are saying, get CRT out of our schools. And on the other side, you have folks who are saying, wait a minute, hold on. We want to be teaching about Black history, queer history, Indigenous history. And there's this constant back and forth around what are we valuing in terms of teacher practice, but also what are we valuing in terms of the delivery to our young people and what skills, knowledge, and capacities they should be equipped with. So that's one example. I think the other example, if you click, Glenn, would really be around again, what are we prioritizing? What should teachers be teaching? And also, what does the broader community think that teachers should be teaching in the classroom? So, I put a couple just quick statistics up here. 54% of Americans say parents should be able to opt out their children out of learning about LGBTQ issues, right? And it's interesting, some of this data. Um, you see here teachers generally believing parents should not be able to opt out, all adults being at 52% and all teachers being at 60%. But I also think it's more stark that 25 and 34%, even though those are smaller percentages, do believe that there should be an opt-out position here. Um, Same thing when we talk about whether it's sexual orientation or we talk about racism, right? These concepts that are embedded within our curriculums, there has been this almost volleyball type experience going on where folks deeply believe that there should be that level of opt-out. I think on the right side, right, most teachers think that students should learn about the legacy of slavery still affecting Black Americans today. Um, Again, I think that the percentages, even the 23% and 14%, that the slavery is part of American history but does not affect Black Americans today, it really calls into question what do we value and what are we prioritizing in our classroom. And the bottom statistic, 49% of parents say they'd rather their children learn about the legacy of slavery, how it still affects the position of Black folks, while 42% say they'd rather children learn that slavery no longer affects Black Americans, right? Ignoring necessarily the legacy of Reconstruction and the ongoing fight for racial justice. So again, we can pick apart a lot of the data like Glenn was doing in his slides, but I think the idea that these seemingly cemented facts that we are dealing with in K to 12 education can be this almost tug of war back and forth, really calls into question again, what do we value and what do we care about? Glenn, if you can keep going. This one for me kind of stood out. About 4 in 10 teachers say current debates about K to 12 education have had a negative impact on their job, right? I'm not here to be a downer, but when we have 40% of teachers, which I think personally is probably a little bit higher, um, saying that these conversations and this polarization that is taking place within our K to 12 spaces is having a negative effect on their job performance, on how they see the value of their job. Um, I think we need to take a harder look at what is driving this polarization, but also what are those supports and ways in which we can alleviate those pressures off of teachers who are facing this every day. And I'll be honest, I don't think we're just talking about socialist teachers. I think we're really speaking about all of humanities teachers, but also just in general. I think teachers are feeling more and more and more pressures coming from a variety of different angles. Um, when we're talking about speaking about critical debates in our classroom, having this negative squeeze should concern us all, because this is dragging down the fidelity and the effectiveness of what K to 12 education should be about. And again, going back to the effectiveness of that public good around K to 12. And then if you keep going, just a couple other examples for you, right? We've had really for a while, but it's definitely more stark now. Um, this constant debate around how much do we privatize? How much do we allow for free market values to come into K to 12 education? And how much do we to defend that general public good? And so we are dealing with right now an administration, and it's not the first administration to do this, but an administration who is openly encouraging and trying to blossom a voucher system that potentially could have dire consequences on public education. Um, we have a administration that is really, trying to foster a broader approach to privatization, thinking that that is in the best interest of students. And there's a real question on, is that the right approach? Is that something that we should really allow as constituents and as stakeholders? And then the last thing I'll just mention in our next slide is, um, I think we also can't marginalize the both the good work that teachers unions are doing right now, stepping up, really making sure that um, teachers have their benefits, are protected on the job, that they feel like the working conditions are secured and healthy and prosperous. But then we also have this intentional attempt to say, well, your union is trying to screw you over, and your union, why is your union charging all these dues, and you should be able to opt out. People have to make their own personal decisions, but I think this idea that unions are out to, attack teachers and be an enemy of teachers is concerning. I'll just speak from example, and if there's other teachers on the call, I've gotten the mailers where it says you should remove yourself from your union. Your union is doing X, Y, and Z, and it just calls into question again the structures and systems that we've had for a quite a while. Um, what are we valuing, and how do we kind of mitigate that tug of war and that polarization we are seeing on either side? So again, I could probably go on and on about a number of other issues, but I think our goal tonight is to kind of grapple with both higher education and K to 12. Where are we seeing these problems, and how do we kind of see some possibilities emerging from here? So I'll kick it back over to Glenn.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Jake. So, yeah, obviously, this is a little bit of table setting from both of our perspectives and experience as educators. Now we want to hear from you all, as the structure has it. We're going to get into breakout groups in just a moment so that we can hear from you, particularly on a couple of questions. The first one is, how has polarization been showing up in your world? What problems has it created? So I'm sure none of this is entirely new to all of you. I think you've seen it in your personal lives, in your professional lives, in your political work. So we'd like to kind of take the temperature and see what's happening in your world. And then we're going to move on to a second question from there, based on what you've heard, both, in terms of your own experience, but also what you're hearing from the others in your group. What possibilities do you think polarization might open up for human rights education in particular? So if the overall goal of this session is to think about HRE as a particular tool for addressing polarization. What are we hearing about these experiences that creates those possibilities for us to work on it? So we're going to do three breakout groups. I'm going to facilitate one, Jake's going to facilitate one, and Christy's going to facilitate one. I think, Jake, maybe you've sorted us all into groups at this point. Okay, let me stop sharing then. So we're going to move into those breakout groups. We've got those questions. The facilitators have them. So we'll go in, we'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll open up the conversation. We'll be in there for about 15 minutes. Is that right, Jake? Okay. Then we'll come back and do a debrief of all of us together in the main room. We'll share out what happened. I'll ask at least one person from each group to share out, and we'll have some conversation from there. And then we'll do a second round of conversations dedicated to really beginning to strategize about how we can work in our own spaces to advance this agenda in some way. So, all right. With that, Jake, do you want to, apparate us away into our breakout groups?
Happily. So we'll
Okay.
be back in about 15 minutes, y'all. Hope you enjoy your conversations.
All right. Man, that's jarring, right? You kind of pulled, yanked out of your conversation and then back dumped in the big room. But I guess this is how it works now. Well, thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for talking. I hope your conversations in your groups were as productive as ours. We didn't get to the second question. I don't know if Jake and Christy, you did a better job facilitating than I did. We were just having such a rich set of conversations about the problems. Well, I guess that's par for the course at this point. And so maybe what we can do is just share out a little bit of what emerged from each of our groups, and then ask for some additional comments or maybe extend some of these or draw out some of the themes before we go back in and start thinking about approaches to addressing some of these challenges. But I don't know, Jake or Christy, if you had somebody who was assigned to report out or if you just want to do it. But to give a little flavor of what went on in your conversation would be great.
Yeah, I can go first. I think we dabbled in that second question. I think we talked about the first one for a good amount of time. And folks were talking about the real struggles of, particularly when we talk about K to 12 practice, how different districts can have different priorities, how your supervisors, your administrators might be willing to back you up in certain circumstances, but in many other circumstances, they're not necessarily leaving you out to dry, but they're dealing with a number of other priorities. And so when they hear community members coming in saying we should not be teaching this, this, and this, they might be more apt to leaning towards those parents, those community members, and not necessarily backing up the teachers. And that could create a sense of both marginalization, but also a real sense of burnout and a sense of like, why continue if I'm not going to be backed up and really supported in my job? So I think that was definitely a looming concern. I think we talked about how we can use language intentionally. So there's a lot of really powerful language and tools we can use when using the HRE principles, but also not abandoning the meaningful efforts we have done around DEI, around social justice, and how we can kind of craft our language and our protocols in a way that's kind of an intermixing of a number of those different pathways. And then we really kind of centered around this idea of, in our spaces of learning, how do we continually really cement these universal ideas of dignity and respect? And so, again, scratching the surface, like I'm sure Christine and Glenn's group, but I think there was some meaningful, powerful threads that we pulled out.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, some echoes in what we talked about, although most of our folks were on the other side of the teacher student component. Christy, do you want to share out a little bit about what you all talked about?
Well, I'll throw out a couple of things and I'll, Cynthia and Corinne and Chloe and Claire, feel free to jump in. I think one thing I'll mention that Brian, who had to jump off here, had mentioned is that he's had to really adjust some of the language he's using to teach. And so he's been working on environmental justice, but has found on the possibility that using the human rights framework and his students have taught him actually that, wait, no, climate justice is a human rights issue. And in using human rights language, there may be some new possibilities. And I think that both Corinne and Cynthia and Chloe, they all shared some examples. And I know Cynthia's talked about the public narrative shifts of Marshall Gantz. And Cynthia, I don't know if you want to share a little bit more in detail about that, or Corinne was just talking about how also when we've had challenges in the of health and well-being with the SNAP program, that she has, classrooms that are very diverse in economic well-being. And although they've done fundraising drives for food or food drives, now they've had to use them within their own classes in school. And so how that, the folks who have more have been bringing for other families. But that's challenging in and of itself. And then what do we do with, that shouldn't have to be. And it's reframing some of that. I don't know, Cynthia, Corinne, Chloe, Claire, do you have additional comments?
I think you summed it up pretty well.
Yeah.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear you got onto some of those strategies for addressing, and maybe in a minute we can hear a little more, particularly about the ways in which HRE language and human rights language can maybe provide a different framing that diffuses some of this polarization, because I think that is really one of the potential positives that is created as an opportunity for HRE. I'll just note, in our group, one of the things that really emerged is the kind of way in which the larger political dynamics influence both, what's happening in the world and in our schools, and then, have this effect on our families and how we're relating to one another in our families, and the kind of divergent political views that some members might have, and the difficulty in talking with them about these questions, and the strategies we have to come up with to manage conflict within the families. All of that tracks with the larger set of shifts that are really concerning. We talked a little bit about the kind of move among working class people from Democratic leaning to Republican leaning, and the tension that this creates, not only about higher education but about social programs more generally. And I think right now this moment of the imperilment of SNAP is really coming to the fore. And there was this great quote that I'm gonna say, and you can attribute it to you if you want, but it was that maybe it became easier to punch down after you've been trying to punch up for so long. Right, that there's this kind of exhaustion with the inability to change the larger system that created some frustration. And then we also had a conversation about vouchers and the way in which those are increasingly also dividing our communities, and that they are leading to both a kind of physical separations of the students who take those vouchers and move off to different schools, but then also breakups of the school communities themselves, the closure of schools, the de-resourcing of schools that are left behind, and what that means for people who are really committed to the principle of public education. And then I think the last thing I heard in a couple of our comments is, thinking about, I think many of us in the conversation, several of us were parents, and thinking about, the kinds of advice we're giving our children about what they become involved in and what they don't become involved in. And is now a time to encourage your kids to become involved in politics? When you see what, normally we'd all be really excited about our kid who's interested in going into politics and being a part of that decision making, but seeing how nasty and ugly and dangerous it can be, it makes us hesitant to say, oh yes, go out and speak your truth and make that good trouble. Is that a good, is that a safe thing to do now? So I think all of those things showed up across. Yeah, is there anything I left out from our group? No.
I see that Kavita was talking about the DEI ban in Texas K-12 schools, and I actually, I know Cynthia had mentioned that, like even in the reframing of how are we working across polarizations to address current issues, whether it's deportations, whether it's the DEI restrictions. And I did uphold at least a hope that I saw, which was Pranav. I mentioned your survey that you did, reaching out to families who actually had, around what they thought should be taught. And at least it was a little glimmer of hope for me in that many of them came back with, yes, we do want our young people learning about some of these positive core human rights principles still, even in the tough, situations that we assume, people don't want things taught. I think being able to reframe and think about how can we ask questions in different ways so that communities can share their truth.
I think that's a really good point, Christy. I mean, when I was presenting some of that data about polarization, there's actually another set of literature that focuses at the issue level of what people are thinking and feeling. And in fact, there is way more overlap than some of these numbers would, or some of this polarization data would lead you to believe, that if you avoid certain kind of triggering words, or words that really kind of people identify with one party or another, and just talk about some of the kind of basic principles of a social safety net, or opportunities to get ahead, or treating people fairly and equally and with dignity, that there's a tremendous amount of consensus among most people in the United States, and really in lots of parts of the world, and that the polarization part is a kind of media artifact, right? It's a kind of artifact of the way in which we get stuck in echo chambers, and then we start to view each other. So, maybe there's a space using the fundamental language of human rights that really tries to get past some of that, propaganda or mystification, or however we want to characterize it, that gets in the way of people seeing how much they actually do agree.
I was actually just going to say that I wish I could remember his name. There's a content creator on Instagram that will actually go out and give people the definition of a term without actually giving them the triggering term. And then, oh yeah, we should totally be doing that. So you agree with DEI or affordable health care. Wait, what? No, that's the definition I just read you. So that's kind of to your point, that it's the word or the term that's kind of setting people off, not the idea. They hear it and then everything else just shuts down.
And I will say, from again higher education and being at Columbia University, where obviously we attracted the attention of those who would seek to kind of undermine this work. Uh, Human rights wasn't the main target of that, right? The target has been Middle East studies, it has been gender studies, it has been DEI work. And so I think there is a space in which human rights is just off to the side of that kind of targeting and provocations around the trigger words that maybe is a lane for, the kind of work that HRE USA and other folks who are conversant in the language of human rights can take. So yeah, others like what has come up? What are you hearing in some of these conversations that maybe are inspiring? And maybe we'll take one more comment and then move to the last segment. Or maybe we won't take one more comment and we'll just move to the last session. Okay. Well, let me do that then. I'll kick it over to
Glenn, if you don't mind, I'll share the slides.
you'll do it. Okay, you've
Yeah.
got it. Okay, yep.
Perfect.
It's all you.
So thanks, folks. We wanted to spend, we want to be mindful of time, but we did want to spend a little time tonight really looking at how do we build effective strategies? Because it's one thing to talk about how polarization manifests. I think it's another thing to get into strategies that we could actually implement in our particular spaces. I just want to give you a quick model before we get into a deeper conversation. So I teach a human rights course at the high school I work at. It's interesting. I bring up this model of workers' rights, and I put this in front of, we spent a number of days on workers' rights with students and really frame it around how are your workers' rights, particularly for folks who are under 18, maybe different than a 25-year-old or a 50-year-old. And I really always lean into a concrete strategy of trying to stimulate effective dialogue and conversation in class. And so I just want to give this as a quick concrete. I do this attitude inventory where students individually have to kind of assess their own attitudes and perspectives on these pretty broad and pretty nebulous statements about their workers' rights. And they do that individually. They kind of assess their own attitudes, and then we put them in small groups to really start to build some effective consensus. And I will tell you, every year I've done this, the dialogue, the conversations around those groups of 3 or 4 really gets deep. They are deeply, deeply concerned around how they should be treated, how they should be valued, how they should be respected within their particular place of occupation. And I say this because when we talk about broader workers' rights, they can be polarizing, right? We have a variety of different beliefs on how we should be treated in our particular workplace. And I think just leaning into that dialogue, that conversation, and really stimulating and giving folks the opportunity to speak their truth can be an effective strategy, whether that's at the university level or K-12 level. And Glenn and I can definitely share some other kind of dialogue and deliberation strategies and methodologies with you as well. But I just wanted to give you a concrete to kind of place that before we go into our next activity. I'm going to do a little pivot here. For our next kind of breakout, we wanted to just offer these questions to you to kind of start to consider in small groups. We're going to put these in the chat so that you have them. But we would like you to really think about what are some effective strategies that we can use or create or implement in our own spaces, utilizing human rights ed principles, and really making sure that we're not only countering polarization, but we're addressing it and mitigating it in a way that is actually going to create meaningful change and create positive spaces of learning. So we were going to do another tech piece to this. I think our facilitators, we will drop that tech piece into the chat if you so choose. But really what we're going to do is have a dialogue around these a couple questions. And then Glenn, Christy, and I will give you this menti.com link We would love you as you're kind of thinking tonight, strategizing, even after tonight, to drop your thoughts to these questions on this menti.com link. This is going to kind of synthesize all of your responses together, just so we can kind of capture it and really gather your insights together. We were going to do this in a more formal way, but we want to make sure that we respect your time this evening. So if Glenn and Christy could kind of take that link, drop it in your small groups, and we're just going to really take, I don't know, the next 10 minutes or so to think about some of these strategy questions that we can dialogue around. All right, if there's no other questions, I'll stop sharing, and then we'll be out for about 10 minutes in these breakout rooms. I think I did it almost correct. So if you're in another breakout room, I am very sorry. And we'll be out for about 10 minutes. Thank you all very much.
And
Go ahead,
Jake,
Chris.
were you going to drop those questions in the chat, or should we just share them on our slides that we
Why
have?
don't you share it in the slides? That
Okay.
would be great.
Thanks.
Thank you. All right, here we go.
What's up, Moira? It said we were returning to the main session, but where is everybody?
I don't know where we went.
Oh, yep, there's somebody new. Okay, they're trickling in. So, Jake, while we're all trickling in, are we going to see people's answers?
Yeah, so in the Menti link, what I can do is I can share out, once people have kind of filled that out, I can share a view-only link for folks so you can look at each of those slides. But again, since we don't have a whole lot of time to speak about it tonight, we're going to give that link to all y'all so you can fill it out, give your responses, and then we'll share that out afterwards.
Great. Are you going to send that to our emails, like the people who registered?
Yeah, so whatever email you registered with, we'll send that out. We'll send the slides as well so you have it.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you.
Excellent. We're also, just as we're waiting here for everyone to come back in, for each of the TAAS sessions, we're developing kind of a compendium document of all the resources that are being brought up in each of these sessions. So we'll get that out to y'all as well. Hopefully by the end of our last session in the spring, folks will have kind of an arsenal and a toolkit to kind of use from each of these sessions.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right, everyone. I think we're coming back right now. Thank you for your time this evening. In our last quick couple minutes, just want to do a couple last minute housekeeping items. Well, actually, let's pause for real quick. Maybe Glenn and Christy, very quick highlights from your group. I don't want to marginalize that, but any quick highlights from your group in the conversation?
I mean, mostly we just tried to work on the piece, but I will say, Katie, who just stepped away, talked about the importance of artistic approaches to education as another way of diffusing and confusing attempts to suppress particular points of view, which I thought was really valuable. So, yeah.
Excellent. Christy, any thoughts?
I know Cynthia was talking about working on a workshop that is exciting around how to basically do this work. And I don't know, Cynthia, if you wanted to share a little more on your kind of initiative.
We're building on a training of trainers program, but Jake, to your point, like also talking about how to have and engage in dialogue and to be able to listen across ideological differences. And then how to I mentioned public narrative because we're trying to really connect to how we can like establish shared values with people and share, to really start to talk through and to apply the principles of human rights to these shared values because, most everyone, can't even say that, but like, believes in inclusion and participation and equality and non-discrimination. And so like, how do we really apply those principles when we're talking about these really difficult issues?
Thanks, Cynthia. And I'll just share real quick from my group. We talked about how can we use fictional scenarios to kind of pull people away and give some objectivity to these real issues that we're facing. So designing fictional scenarios, but then adding some real world elements to those so that people are evaluating with an objective eye. And then we also talked about, again, building structures in our K-12 system, particularly at that K-6 level, of building in HRE teaching and learning practices, training teachers at an early level in which to kind of build an HRE focused classroom that will help mitigate, even at an early level, some of those issues of polarization that we're seeing. So really rich conversation. I was saying in my group, there's a lot to kind of unpack this evening for sure. We're barely scratching the surface. Go ahead, Christy.
So sorry. I just wanted to mention something that Corinne, that I'll take away, that on that second question, when like, what do we do at school board meetings and how do we get, you know, when people are kind of on edge? And she said, we just throw out the why, so that the arguments, you know, you're actually wanting to listen, but you're beginning to at least tease out what the conversation is. And I think something else that was raised is asking young people, what do they want to learn? And then how do we really raise issues around, you know, catering to some of those needs more effectively.
All right, folks. Well, thank you. A quick couple housekeeping things. If you are interested in staying connected with us, we do have a newsletter. We'll share these slides out afterwards. But please click on our newsletter, follow us on any of our social media platforms. We'd love to kind of continue to keep you as part of the HRUSA family. Our next session, it's kind of crazy to think we've done 5 sessions this fall. Our next session will be on January 26th, Monday, January 26th at 7 p.m. Really focused on intersectional democracy. We're actually going to have 2 sessions focused on this idea of intersectional democracy. The first one being on race and migration. So we would love you to follow up and attend that session. And again, we'll get out that registration link as well, but it's here on the slides. I put in the chat a quick evaluation. We would love your feedback and your thoughts on how we can continue to improve these TAAS sessions. It is here on a QR code if you'd like to scan that. It's also in the chat. So please take a few minutes to fill that out for us. And then really just these questions that kind of continue for you to think about. After our session this evening, what questions do you have? Are there ways we can continue to assist you? And then any wonder questions. We just put these out there for y'all to think about. If you want to shoot Christy, Glenn, myself an email, we're always open to having these conversations with you. And again, we really appreciate your time and your commitment to dialoguing and experiencing this evening together. So thank you all very much. I'll leave this QR code up here, and we hope you have a wonderful evening and rest of your week.
And I just dropped a link into for our Human Rights Day celebration, which will be December 10th at 4 p.m. ET, an hour to learn around the Youth Human Rights Awards. We actually have Pranav, who is one of last year's Youth Award winners, here online, but you'll learn about who's the 2025 awardees, as well as the O'Brien Award recipients and more. So if you're able to join that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jake and Glenn, for facilitating a wonderful session. I'm trying
Thank
to
you,
end.
Christy.
You, Christy. Yeah.
I'm trying to end recording unsuccessfully. Where is?
Okay. Thanks for being here, Claire. I don't know if you're still there.
Oh, Jake, I know I can't do it. Your host.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Hold on.
I'm like, I cannot chop this up. Okay, well, I'll have to remember to ask Jasmine to chop the ending.
And if I hit stop recording, it goes to the cloud.
The cloud, yeah. Just,
All right.
yeah.